Welcome to another episode of the Hate Meditations podcast. It's Mother's Day. I'm extremely hungover, and rather than spending time with my family, I am recording an episode of this podcast for the benefit of some loathsome, ungrateful freaks online that is our listenership. And we are talking today about a character that I am sure will attract no ire whatsoever in our treatment of it. Um, but yeah, we're talking about the big guy, Tolkien, and his relationship to metal. Um, I will immediately caveat it by saying we're not going to be doing an exhaustive rundown of every single metal band that's ever referenced Tolkien, nor are we. Well, I can't speak for the other guests I have on here, but we're not going to do a deep dive into Tolkien lore necessarily, although I'm sure that will come up at certain points. But I think it is a fascinating topic, just in how different areas of metal, different genres and subgenres, have a very different kind of. They express their love of Tolkien in very different ways, and it's interesting how he keeps cropping up. Um, you could largely look at this in relation to metal's crossover with geek culture, and obviously Tolkien being sort of the OG, or the goat, as the kids tend to say these days, of fantasy literature. But also the connection does go a bit further back with bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, sort of referencing him. The former, in terms of, I think, just on the Wizard. I'm not fully convinced that it was actually a Tolkien reference. I think they were just fucking high and talking about a drug dealer. And obviously Led Zeppelin as well. Although again, they just can't help but referencing Mordor and then talking about being horny, which is very on the nose for Led Zeppelin. But there's that connection between sort of out of the hippie culture of the 60s. There was a lot of crossover with kind of early fantasy culture as a sort of outgrowth of spiritualism and the occult, and kind of that sort of brand of escapism and so on. But more broadly, I would say the interesting sort of theme for me is that metal is always a bit stuck up and insecure about its own legitimacy when compared to other genres of music. It's always been, sometimes regarded as vulgar and primitive and just for horny teenage boys. Not entirely unwarranted in that regard. And you could say the exact same thing about Tolkien to some degree. And I'll actually quote this lecture given by a historian of Protestantism, Alec Rahy, who, in discussing Tolkien, and I'll link this in the description, but he said, to many people, it's incongruous or even a little embarrassing that the best-selling work of fiction of the whole 20th century is an excessively long, unapologetically archaic, and sometimes self-indulgent fairy tale written by a philologist and very traditional Catholic, whose most devoted readers were and remain teenage boys. But there is no gainsaying its cultural importance. And I think that quote pretty much sums up the regard that Tolkien is held by, you know, what's the word? The official kind of view in literature, in that he's still regarded as a bit vulgar and sort of you judge him by his fans, which are teenage boys. Although I think that perception is changing, not least after the Peter Jackson films, but also the fact that geek culture and metal, in sort of confluence with that, became more popular, and so-called non-geeks were kind of getting into it by the 2010s in a way similar to, like, traditional geek stuff like comic books and fantasy and so on. I suppose from my own perspective, obviously, I do very much adore Tolkien's world. I wouldn't say I'm sort of a Tolkien head in the way that some people are, but kind of, again, speaking to that quote, you can't really ignore him, especially if you're into metal. And I guess for me as well, I was never much of a geek, but I kind of got the worst of both worlds at school, in that I was ostracized, but I wasn't blessed with the intelligence or the imagination to be a geek. So I was just kind of there. And yeah, but in that regard, it's still something that I can't ignore, in terms of his influence on the culture that I enjoy. So that's enough from me. I am joined, very glad to be joined by Tyler, who is on as ever. Good to have you on, Tyler.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. Really big fan of Tolkien, so this should be a fun episode for me.
Awesome. Yeah, I know you read the Silmarillion quite a lot. I've only read it once, but yeah, we might be leaning on you for some of the references. And we've also got Joseph on, who's I think it was your idea to do this episode. So yeah, thanks very much for that as well.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in the intersection between metal music and sort of wider world of literature and storytelling. So this seemed like a prime topic.
Awesome. And I believe Belisario has also jumped on. Are you there, Belisario?
Yes, I'm here. A bit late, but here.
Awesome. No, glad you could join. It's good to have you on. So yeah, like I said, we're not going to sort of structure this too formally, but I was thinking we might kind of do it chronologically in terms of I mentioned obviously the early references from early kind of proto metal and stuff, and you can also throw, I believe, Rush in there as well. But it's not really until the 80s that the sort of connection is forged pretty strongly between metal as it was developing at the time and Tolkien. And I think, as I mentioned in the introduction, you could kind of chalk that up to the crossover with geek culture and D&D getting pretty big at that time. And the band that will always come up in that subject is Sirif Ungol, or as Tolkien pronounced it, Kirith Ungol. But I read they changed it to the soft C to make it easier for Americans to pronounce. I don't know if that's true, but anyway, and they're kind of like pre extreme metal. I would say they're the archetypical kind of geek band in that they are very unapologetic in their celebration of like high fantasy, and yeah, a few other bands around that time sort of making scant references to Tolkien. But the way it differs from later extreme metal is it's less about referencing it in kind of plucking just the vocabulary and the proper nouns of Middle Earth and really kind of worshipping the idea. It's more kind of a celebration of it in a more literal sense, in that they are trying to get across the themes of like heroism, the hero's journey, the sense of adventure and power, and the sort of the brighter elements of Tolkien's world than what black metal bands would later do. So yeah, I'll throw it out there to anyone that wants to come in terms of like the earlier stuff. I mean, I know Blind Guardian came a little bit later, but we could kind of talk about them in the same category as well, because they're probably the most like prominent band in the sort of heavy power metal, speed metal oeuvre that reference sort of Tolkien.
Are we not going to talk about Leonard Nimoy here?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, I had to get that in there.
Yeah, I mean, I know I said we weren't going to do a comprehensive rundown of every Tolkien reference, but how could I forget that one? It's interesting though. I mean, on a serious note, it is interesting that like like Warhammer D&D, the sort of rise of that like high fantasy thing, which was still pretty underground in the 80s and 90s, and obviously prior to the Peter Jackson films. But before that, like the Tolkien thing was very much like, I don't know, quite gay.
Well,
like,
they were. Yeah, I mean, actually, there's
camp
a lot.
is the word I'm looking for. Sorry, camp.
Yeah. There's a lot of things from the 60s and 70s I think are important to hit on, because I do think they're relevant for why Tolkien then became appealing to, say, power metal and black metal in the 90s. But yeah, I mean, we can. I did a little bit of research in terms of like how the Tolkien, I mean, the works like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings became popular, and I could kind of start there. But Tyler, if you have somewhere you kind of feel like, because you're the Tolkien scholar amongst us here, I think.
Sure. I mean, if we're talking about specifically the relation to music, Shelley pretty much hit the nail on the head. But I mean, we could also talk about, when mentioning proto metal specifically, there's references to Tolkien and Led Zeppelin, of course. I believe Queen, Black Sabbath even ambiguously referenced Tolkien with the song The Wizard. You had progressive rock bands like Camel and Rush mentioning Tolkien. I mean, when The Hobbit exploded, Tolkien was largely not expecting it to do so. If I remember correctly, it was a bedtime story that he made for his children that then somehow or another was told to neighborhood children, friends of his, who then strongly encouraged him to write it. So he did, just kind of on a whim, and then the story became massively popular. And leading into The Lord of the Rings, his publisher essentially pressured him to write a sequel, and he initially proffered The Silmarillion as his next published work, and his publisher looked at it and basically said no.
I wonder why.
Absolutely not. And this really irritated Tolkien because he had been writing the Silmarillion ever since he was a young man. I think since he was probably 17 or 18 years old, and the stories even extended further back than that. And it was kind of his baby, his life's work, in his opinion. But he decided to write a sequel to The Hobbit, and you can kind of see the change in tone in The Lord of the Rings. The beginning of the Fellowship reads a lot like The Hobbit. It's very childlike. It's about, I think, chapter 4, if I remember right, is Shadow of the Past, when it takes on a more serious tone. The reason being that Tolkien decided, hey, if you're not going to let me publish a Silmarillion, I'm going to work some of it into this story. I'm going to take that mythology and make it a backdrop for this sequel to The Hobbit. Prior to that, they actually weren't connected at all. And then later on, he actually rewrote The Hobbit to strengthen some of the connections. But the interesting thing about that, and I think this actually connects to his intersection with music as well, is that in taking the Silmarillion, which is influenced by a lot of mythology and classical works of literature and has a much more serious tone to it, and then combining it with the more kind of like fairy tale nature of The Hobbit, he created a kind of meeting place between the two that I would argue to some extent, perhaps not entirely, because there's other authors you could mention as contributors, pretty much set the foundations for what became the modern fantasy novel.
Yeah. I mean, I think before Tolkien, fantasy was, in large part, just like science fiction, had kind of been in that pulp realm. Like it was a lot of geeks and dorks and a lot of kind of cheap publications, like the idea of high fantasy as opposed to sort of low fantasy, which would be like Conan the Barbarian or something along those lines, really comes about with Tolkien. And partially I think that's because of his academic background and how much detail he put into sort of the research of his work.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of the reason it keeps new generations keep rediscovering it as well is not just the completeness of the world, but it's also partially down to what Ty was describing there in the changing tones. Because as a child, like I think a lot of children have this rite of passage where their parents read The Hobbit to them as kids. And then you get into it when you're a little bit older, and then as you become a teenager, you're introduced to Lord of the Rings, and you read that, and then maybe into early adulthood, you try and tackle the Silmarillion. So he's sort of the whole world has each stage of your early development as a person kind of has a book that can accompany it for your kind of reading level and kind of discovering how complex the world is, because The Hobbit's like a perfect self-contained story in its own right, but then you could just read it and put it down and never think about it again. But the fact that you can then, if you do find it interesting, you can keep digging, and then there's just this wealth of material in Lord of the Rings. And I suppose it is a similar mentality to people discovering metal to some extent, in that they do tend to have that obsessive personality to them, where they discover one thing, they want to know more, they go down a rabbit hole, and they just keep going, see how deep the rabbit hole goes, as it were. And Tolkien is very much like that as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, that intersection between like like I said, the kind of fairy tale nature of The Hobbit and the more very grave and serious, almost somber kind of tragic nature of older tales that he combines in The Lord of the Rings creates this kind of adult fairy tale, I suppose you could say, that really set the mood for how modern audiences interact with that kind of material. Because in the past, before that, you had the pulp material that Joseph mentioned, And you either had something that resembled more childlike fairy tales, or you could turn to something like classical mythology, which could often be kind of brutal and tragic, as I was saying. Um, but Lord of the Rings kind of combined the two to make something that was more palatable to modern audiences. And I think that's why it captured the imagination of so many people at the time, is that it, by bringing the two together, it created something that modern people could more easily relate to. And also, in some ways, and we can get deeper into this later, almost kind of became a mythology of sorts for the modern age. Um, I think that there's a lot of emotional shades to Lord of the Rings that, in one way or another, perhaps unconsciously, kind of speak to modern audiences.
Yeah, I could talk about that in terms of the speculation on his intention of kind of creating a mythology for England in particular through this sort of hybrid, one that sits outside of obviously like his Catholicism or whatever. But I think there's sort of speculation around how intentional that was on his part. But obviously, yeah, because it became a sort of world-renowned thing, there is, yeah, it holds that same appeal as it would do if you're reading sort of, yeah, about Greek mythology or Viking mythology or whatever. Belisario, do you want to talk about like your, I guess, relationship to Tolkien, like how you discovered it, how like when you got into it?
I got into it when I was quite young, when I was 12 or 13, and I fell in love with it. So it's something that I still relate to it in a big part. And so, yeah, you could say it was more like a teenage thing for me. And maybe I would like to point it out, since I'm the only not English native speaker here, that I guess the rest of the world, the non-English speaking one, maybe got to all these works a bit later, and that was when it really exploded in the whole world, like maybe a couple of decades later, maybe. So in the beginning, it was more like as far as I know, something that people in university and high school were digging a lot, and then it became more popular, and it spread throughout all the world, and then the top of the popularity would be the movies. So I guess it would be maybe it has some kind of importance that the metal bands got into it when it was still not so popular in the whole world. Like it was something a bit secret still, and something that many people didn't know about. So I guess many bands, maybe not from the English-speaking countries, but related to that partly because it was something not so widespread still.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a good point to raise to sort of bring it back to his relationship to metal is it was an enormous book prior to the films. And yeah, he was sort of known beyond the like fantasy genre of the culture that grew up around fantasy. And in that, I'm including sort of, RPGs and like Warhammer and yeah, metal and, the various kind of, not copycat, but the sword and sorcery films of the 80s and stuff. Like they were big, they were known as like an aesthetic or whatever, but it was still alternative in a lot of ways. Like D&D was still pretty underground, and it was only practiced by a certain type of person, and by that I mean exactly like us, just weirdly geeky, obsessive men. On the whole, I know there are exceptions to that, but yeah, there's that stereotype as well, and it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around if you kind of only got through this stuff through like I want to sort of say the franchise films, not necessarily Lord of the Rings, but the fact that geek culture basically became mainstream by the 2010s. And everyone was into comic books because of the Marvel films and stuff, and everyone was digging into other elements of geek culture, and obviously Tolkien was a huge part of that, and all kinds of spin-offs and whatever. It's sort of been forgotten that fantasy of this kind was, although it was known, it was still pretty alternative. And that meant that, the metal bands that were, like, especially the earlier metal bands that were referencing Tolkien, it wasn't just because everyone was doing it. They actually probably did have a deep love of his work, and took the time to kind of go through his books to kind of and work references into their music and so on. It wasn't sort of just something that everyone was doing. And again, it was that crossover of a certain type of musician who would end up in metal bands who, more than likely had a love of Tolkien and other forms of literature as well. It wasn't sort of mainstream culture.
Well, if you look at like the DIY ethos of the early underground metal scene, especially starting with like the NWO BHM, there's an intense crossover with the aesthetic that I don't think so many people now are familiar with, as popular as the game has become, with tabletop role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons in its early days was, it may seem rather obvious, deeply inspired by Tolkien, to the extent that they originally called halflings in the game hobbits. And I think they received a cease and desist letter from the Tolkien estate. So they decided to change the name. But the artwork that you see in early Dungeons and Dragons is very much obviously just done by, for lack of a better way to put it, it looks like people who were making the game got a hold of their friends who could kind of sketch and asked them to do some drawings for it. And it's a similar aesthetic to you see to like hand-drawn album covers done for early metal bands, drawings that you would see in early metal fanzines. I think there's a lot of crossover in how those two scenes approached what they did. And so you could easily imagine that there was probably also some crossover in the fan base as well. There was probably a lot of people who were just as excited about getting into this world where you kind of had to figure out things on your own. You kind of had to put together how you were going to do it. In tabletop role-playing gaming, and then having the same kind of nerdy obsession with underground metal as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that for a world that is so complete and like well realized, it's also quite open-ended. Like it's like a toy box where everyone can sort of pluck ideas from it and play with it and take it in their own direction. And D&D is a really good example of that. Fantasy literature in general, but also metal as well. Even things like the concepts of like what we think of as elves and orcs and goblins. They were very different entities prior to Tolkien sort of reimagining them. They were much more like fairies and things like that, where you can lift the concept of a fantasy creature from Lord of the Rings and just put it in different settings. And I think Warhammer's a really good example of that. And it's no surprise that they did like a line of models when the films came out as well. There's just so much material there where you can kind of just take it and run with it yourself a little bit in a way that you can't necessarily do if you're a musician and you want to, I don't know, you're inspired by particular historical events or whatever. You're kind of slightly more restricted in how you interpret it to some extent. Whereas with something like Tolkien, you might not even reference something specifically Tolkien, but you're referencing his interpretation of what a dwarf is, for example, or what an elf is and so on, or what a troll is, and just taking it in your own direction. So it's very open-ended in that way. And I think that's one of the reasons why it appeals to this type of character that we're talking about.
And as well, one of the major characters in Lord of the Rings is Gandalf, and that's why, even though it might be questionable how much Black Sabbath really cited him, but when you think about in literature and mythology, notion of sort of this benevolent, or at least somewhat benevolent wizard type figure, until Gandalf, the only one that really is, I think, present in Western culture is Merlin. So Tolkien made a huge stamp in this whole idea of what, in all of fantasy, of what even a wizard is, with Gandalf.
Yeah, and then that's another really good example as well, where he's lifting quite a lot from older mythology, but he's sort of bringing it up to date and sort of something that a modern audience resonated with a modern audience.
Yeah. And I think it's definitely tapping into certain tropes about Merlin, but even in this day, when you look at more recent fantasy, the presence of Gandalf in any sort of wizard type character is just so pronounced. Even to the fact that how people compare, as distant as it is, but something like the Harry Potter films, the whole idea of like the Dumbledore character being very kind of Gandalf-esque.
I mean, yeah, he's the first example that comes to mind for me. I'm sure there's plenty of others, but yeah, it's sort of like a trope, I guess they'd call it. Yeah, so I guess sort of getting specifically onto metal, like
Well,
the
I think it's important, especially before we go too far ahead and then jump back. Let me give a quick, because I think it's important to understand how, like, bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Rush, and all these bands, why Tolkien was on their radars in the first place. And from some of the things I was reading, it's interesting to note that, so Lord of the Rings came out around the 50s, like mid-50s, I believe, and it had a relative small amount of popularity, but in general, pretty reserved in the United Kingdom. But there was an interesting dynamic that happened. It had only been published in hardback, in hard copy, and Tolkien was very insistent on that because he did not think... There was a general perception, he certainly had it at the time, that soft cover and paperback was kind of a more trashy format, and he didn't think that was appropriate for Lord of the Rings. So they weren't publishing that. But there was a discrepancy between UK and US publishing law. And since Tolkien's publishers didn't publish in softcover, an American company basically felt they had the right to do it on their own without Tolkien's permission. So they released a very cheap paperback version of The Lord of the Rings, and specifically sent it to colleges. And this has happened around the time of the 60s. And I think their impetus for it was this was the time of like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. So even sort of the beginnings of the hippie era, but really what we would call the British invasion, and that anything British kind of had a stamp of like teenage and slightly older interests, just because everyone was obsessed with anything that might have to do with something interesting coming from the UK. And in part, a paperback would suit that better than a hardcover, because hardcover was associated more with sort of like something your professor or your teacher might recommend to you. Soft cover, again, that sort of trashy association, but young people were relatively fine with that or thought that was cooler. So they were pretty apt in recognizing that, and the book really did catch on. And especially in high schools and colleges. I think they sent a ton to like every like college library. And then Tolkien's publishing company eventually sued and got back the rights to it. But they looked at the data of how much those books were selling, and using that convinced Tolkien to do an official paperback release. And that really was around the time of the mid to late 60s with the burgeoning hippie scene. And that really catching on there. And in part because of Tolkien's themes of sort of the romanticization of the rural country life, and that the whole sort of nature versus industry being themes that were very popular with the hippie scene, is why you had a book that became so popular in that culture, and then winding up in the hands of someone like Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, or the guys in Rush, or Geezer Butler in Black Sabbath, who, if you ever look up during the early pre-Black Sabbath days, very much hung out with the hippie crowd. There's a funny photo of him with flowers in his hair. And Robert Plant has spoken about that. And when you listen to those songs where Led Zeppelin very early on kind of mentions Tolkien, like Ramble On, it's interesting because it's not the lyrics, like you mentioned, like they're mentioning Tolkien and then all of a sudden how horny they are. In a weird way, it's sort of this sort of magical realism, where it's like almost like he's like whoever this, person that Robert Plant is singing about or which is sort of himself, but also kind of an everyman, trying to aspire to get this girl that he's got the hots for. And then, like, whatever adversity he has to reach it, he sort of starts imagining it's Golem and the Dark Lord who've stolen away his girl, like it were the One Ring. And then there's other mentions such as the Battle of Evermore, mentioning the ring race. So I think it's just sort of interesting how he just drops these references almost in this sort of magical realism way, like where these books are part of his life, and it just becomes part of the soup of what it's like to be Robert Plant.
Well,
Tolkien's relationship. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, you go, Tyler. It's fine.
Tolkien's relationship to counterculture is really funny, especially in regards to the 70s, because while for reasons like you mentioned, Joseph, in ways he intersected with it on a personal level, being opposed to the rapid spread of industry and romanticizing rural living. In other ways, Tolkien, and I'm not saying this approvingly or disapprovingly, was pretty staunchly conservative in his worldview. And I don't, while he was alive during that time, I don't think there's really much, even in his private letters. I own a copy of a collection of those where he really addresses that too much. So I don't know if there's really too much evidence as to how he personally felt about it, but it is somewhat amusing that he was so readily adopted by a group of people who, in some ways, probably differed from him significantly in their values.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I think that's absolutely true, and definitely Tolkien has a degree of conservatism, and I think there's some even sort of metaphysical levels implied in the world of Middle Earth that imply a very conservative outlook. Like if we get to the whole idea of sort of the elves and Morgoth and kind of what he's doing with those narratives, I would fully agree. There's absolutely a conservatism and sort of a pessimism. And again, it's all these different areas where he's pulling from Norse mythology, whatever remnants of English and British Isle mythology, but then also his Catholicism and Christianity. So it's all coming in there. And yeah, I think it's in a very inadvertent way that certain aspects of it appealed so much to a subculture that he probably wouldn't necessarily fully embrace. But, on the other hand of that is how Lord of the Rings, I mean, this is almost sort of obscure, but the Lord of the Rings kind of became a focal point for the Italian post-World War II fascist movement. These, I think they would call them Hobbitville's, these Hobbit festivals in Italy, which interestingly enough, the current Prime Minister of Italy was apparently very involved in, and she's a big Tolkien fan. But I mean, that's another thing where people found something very appealing in Tolkien that was relevant to their current political interests or current social interests. And latched onto it in a way that Tolkien maybe wouldn't have agreed, because Tolkien was also very stanchly anti-fascist.
I was going to say he did give personal insight into how he felt about fascism, and he did not like it. So he was rather hotly opposed to it. So when it comes to like Italian fascists adopting his his mythology, his stories, I imagine he was displeased.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's sort of the interesting thing. And like when Shelley and I had our last episode about politics, I think probably a very easy thing to say about Tolkien is that his narratives and themes, both people on the left and the right have found very appealing things about it in ways that you could never pigeonhole him as just agreeing or fitting easily with one side or another side, or if we even chopped it up into multiple sides, he still wouldn't easily fit one of these.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's because Tolkien is a real person with depth and nuance who, isn't a walking ideological chatbot. So, so yeah, he has real feelings about things that are based in his experience, and because of that, he's a little messy. He doesn't neatly fit into a category, which I find endearing. I mean, we talked about his Catholicism influencing his works. I'm not Christian in the least, but I admire his works greatly, and I even admire the parts deeply that are quite clearly influenced by his Christianity. A huge debate amongst Tolkien fandom. There are people who viciously want to assert that he's basically Christian propaganda, and people who viciously want to assert that there was no influence from Christianity in his works whatsoever. I think both of them are incredibly wrong.
Yeah, and that's an area I don't think we should go too deeply into, but I mean, I feel like there's a big difference between him and, I mean, he was best friends with him, but there's a big difference between him and C.S. Lewis, though C.S. Lewis had a pretty strong influence on Tolkien's Christianity. But, like, if you compare their major works that they're most well known for, like, The Lion, the Witch, in the Wardrobe series is pretty blatant with its Christianity.
I mean, Aslan outright admits that he's Jesus in the last book. He's like, just explicitly is like, I am Jesus in another world.
Whereas I think Tolkien had an interest. I think Tolkien was very clear about his Christian views, but at the same time, he was someone who very much loved pre-Christian stories, in particular mythology. And so I think he had a respect for non-Christian sources and wanted to include that in his work in a way where obviously his Christian ethics would rub off, but I think he wasn't purely interested in creating a sort of a weird analogy for the Bible in the same way that Lewis was.
Like, with both pre-Christian stories and with his Christianity, Tolkien was somebody who saw to the metaphor, like the emotional experience or impact of those things underneath the symbolism. And that's what he wanted to communicate in his stories, which I think relates to world building as we see it in music and like heavy metal, in that, for instance, brief example of an explicitly Christian influence on Lord of the Rings, the scene at Mount Doom, where Frodo gives in to the temptation to take the ring for himself, and then Gollum attacks him and bites his finger off. Tolkien said in one of his letters that was explicitly influenced by the last lines of the Lord's Prayer, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And the idea was that since Frodo took pity upon Gollum, a creature very difficult to take pity upon, it's even implied at one point that Gollum killed babies, and that God, so to speak, rewarded Frodo by, when Frodo was in a moment of giving in to temptation, using the creature that he took pity upon to deliver him from that temptation. And so Tolkien said that the victory in Mount Doom was not a heroic victory of good defeating evil in martial combat. It was a moral victory for Frodo's soul.
Right. Well, in his letters, doesn't he mention as well that because I've always thought that was an interesting thing, that in the Lord of the Rings, there's only essentially 2 times where the this gets into the cosmology of Lord of the Rings, which obviously the Silmarillion explores far more. But the idea that there is sort of this singular God in the world of the Middle Earth. And that the only 2 times it really intervenes is, one, Gandalf's resurrection, and the second being that scene where Frodo and Gollum are struggling with the ring, and the idea that when Gollum was on the edge of and I forget the name of the Middle Earth deity, but basically gave a gentle push, causing Gollum's fall.
Eru Ilúvatar.
Yeah, Eru Ilúvatar. Yeah.
That is like the only times that God, so to speak, directly intervened. It's implied in Lord of the Rings, but it's an event that happened in The Hobbit, that Ilúvatar had something to do with Bilbo finding the ring as well. That the ring engages in machinations to have people find it that would eventually bring it back to its master.
Right, because essentially part of Sauron's soul or essence is
Right,
in the ring.
exactly. But it's implied by Gandalf that Bilbo finding it was not the ring's machinations. It was not something it intended to happen. Um, so, um, so yeah, I mean, and I'm just bringing that up as an instance of his Christian influence, that he utilized in a way that would not be readily apparent to someone who didn't go digging for it. And not only, and to give an example of how or how Tolkien engaged in world building, in painting like emotional brushstrokes rather than engaging in like explicit symbolism. And I guess also as an example of something where not only do I acknowledge that there is a Christian influence in that particular scene, I actually think it is an excellent scene, and I really deeply admire the emotional impact of that scene, um, despite the fact that I don't share Tolkien's religion. Um, I really think that it's an example of how masterful of a storyteller he is, that he's able to take something like the themes of redemption in his religious beliefs and translate them to a story in a way that extends much deeper than just saying, I'm Christian and I think it's right and you should agree with it too.
That's one of the lasting appeals of Tolkien, is that I think a lot of people find it frustrating in a way, but it's also one of the reasons why he keeps enduring, because he was so private about his actual convictions. And as you said, Tyler, like you sometimes you have to go digging for it. And he was also obviously adamant in the fact that it's not an allegory for anything. And it's something that doesn't really, you don't see that so much anymore. But I think it allows people to um, not impose, that's the wrong word, but project their own interpretation, whether the story is inherently conservative or not, or even if it is inherently conservative, you can still get swept up in the power of the narrative in the world, even if you aren't conservative yourself. And it's one of the things that, it's a rarity these days, and it makes me wonder that if he was a modern author, if that would have happened. But I want to bring Belisario in on the religious aspect, because having read your recent essay on blasphemy and metal, I think you're more qualified to talk about Catholicism than myself.
Oh, I'm not sure if I'm qualified to speak about Catholicism anymore. But yeah, it resonates a bit. And in the case of Tolkien, I think he felt like a minority probably during his whole life, because he didn't belong to the main confession in the UK. So it was, I guess, a very important part of his identity. But I do agree with what you said just before, that he didn't let this come through in his works in a plain way. Like, he didn't take up any specific position. He didn't make any propaganda for Catholicism or religion. And I think what he put in his works is a quite subtle approach. And at the same time, he kept space for all the ancient and old mythological views he liked so much. So it's a kind of mixed approach that is really rich to read afterwards. And when you were talking about these two passages in his works, I remembered another one that was quite striking for me at the time, and I guess still. It's also in one of the movies. It's when during the siege of Minas Tirith, Gandalf is with Pippin, and they're being besieged by orcs and trolls, and Pippin is very afraid that he's going to die. And then Gandalf tries to soothe him, and he tells him that death is not the end. That then the soul gets through and crosses the waters and gets into the golden shores, and it's kind of a resurrection thing. But even if you're not Christian or Catholic, I guess it's quite a very moving passage, and it fits a lot with what Gandalf as a figure is supposed to be, to encourage all the other beings and get the best of them. So I think this, even if it's specifically in this passage, it's really Christian, at least to me, is something that can appeal to anyone, I guess, even from other cultures that are not Christian.
Yeah, we all need someone like Gandalf in our lives. I want to take this opportunity to bring up one of my favorite and shortest passages in the Silmarillion, which is when Gandalf is implicitly mentioned for about a line. He had a different name in the Silmarillion. Make a long story short, he's essentially a kind of angelic spirit of sorts, a lesser one. Sauron actually being of the same order, but a greater one. Um, and he had a different name back then. It was Aloran, if I remember correctly. And it's mentioned how he really liked walking amongst elves, either unseen or hidden in form as one of them, and they weren't sure who was prompting fair visions in their hearts. But the part where I guessed it was Gandalf, and guessed right apparently when I first read that as a child, was it said that in the Silmarillion, Aloran is not mentioned much, but in later tales he became a friend of all of the children of Ilúvatar, and all who listened to him awoke from despair and put away the imagination of darkness from their hearts.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting stuff. I'm conscious we haven't really discussed music much. I was just going to bring it back to Joseph, your discussion of Led Zeppelin and
Hmm.
the fact that counterculture at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, it it was starting to reference things that could be very broadly described as fantasy, not in the sort of high fantasy sense, but you've got bands like the Beatles getting more and more into well, there's the drug culture crossover, but they get more into spiritualism. Um, Prog starts to become a thing by 69, 70, and bands start. It was still unusual in popular music of that time to try and reach for stuff beyond the immediate experience. You're not singing about personal relationships or events that happen to you in your life. You're starting to pull from literature or discuss things that are more philosophical. I think it's things like early King Crimson. A lot of the lyrics are kind of very deep, reflective meditations on the nature of being and whatnot. And it's interesting that Led Zeppelin's references to Tolkien's world are kind of incidental and very much kind of folded into what are kind of rather typical lyrical themes for them. And it's only as the sort of 70s roll on that hard rock and heavy metal becomes more interested in the world building aspect and going deeper into fantasy and history as well to some extent, and singing about things that are completely unrelated to the immediate experiences of the musicians themselves. They're starting to explore their imagination from a lyrical perspective as well as a musical one. And I think beyond the obvious, like, the history of metal that was been retold 1,000 times of how each new crop of bands became more, like, harder and more extreme and more ambitious in what they were doing. It's that element of detaching yourself from your circumstance and exploring fantasy that I think really starts to set metal apart from other genres of music at the time, most obviously punk, which was probably one of the most immediate kinds of heavy rock of that era. And Tolkien sort of is obvious, like the obvious target to reach for in terms of finding inspiration in that kind of thing beyond, I don't know, religious themes as well, which is probably the other huge influence on metal of this era as well. I don't know if anyone wanted to expand on that at all.
Well, it's interesting because, we mentioned Sirathungal already, but them and a few other bands you can point to. The 80s, you wouldn't necessarily call like the age of Tolkien metal. Really more that kind of came to the forefront in the 90s, and I'm not exactly sure how to explain that. You can find a few bands have kind of like a song here or there, but like even Sirathungal, almost sort of a reflection of what would happen later in the black metal scene, took the name, and they very much explicitly mentioned, I think it was Robert Gavin and Greg Lindstrom. I'm sure I'm butchering his last name. I'd have to look it up again. But like met up in the literature class, and they were reading Lord of the Rings in high school, and that was where they suddenly got the idea. Oh, hey, look at this word, Sirathungal. Isn't that cool? Let's use that as a band name. And I think the title track on that might kind of reference a bit, but yeah, if you look in 80s metal in general, there's not a giant breadth of Tolkien, even within the fantasy realms. I think probably Conan references are a little bit more prevalent. A lot of more just sort of general D&D. But at the same time, as we already mentioned, Tolkien was already one of the biggest influences on that. But for whatever reason, it really wasn't until the 90s, or at least very, very late 80s into the 90s, that this stuff started showing up more at the forefront.
I mean, we've mentioned the D&D connection a few times, and I don't think that can be understated because most of the
Oh, I agree.
like the early black metal artists, like particularly in Norway, they were all basically just geeks playing D&D, and that's kind of where their crossover with Tolkien's world.
I think a lot of D&D people, especially from the 80s, like if you're playing D&D and you're like, oh, I wish I could get even more of this, it was like, oh, well, you should check out, Lord of the Rings, or you should check out Michael Moorcock or something like that. But yeah, I mean, when we do, I think it's important to know for people who maybe aren't super familiar with the 80s that explicit Lord of the Rings references weren't actually that prevalent. But I imagine pretty soon here we'll start talking about especially black metal and power metal from the 80s into the 90s, where it really did kind of get much more of a presence.
Can we talk about for a moment why authors like Michael Moorcock were not more influential on metal than Tolkien was? Because at a surface level glance, you think they would be. I mean, Michael Moorcock was arguably the first anti-Tolkien salvo in fantasy literature. And he seems to be much more focused on like a kind of gritty nihilistic idea that people aren't that heroic in real life, that really they are
Well,
kind of a
yeah.
mixture of the two, you know? And
Oh,
you would
no,
think
no,
that would
fully.
resonate
Yeah.
with metal more. And Michael Moorcock has had an influence on metal from
Yeah.
bands like Blind Guardian all the way to other power metal bands and perhaps some black metal, although I don't think he's really had that much of an impact on black metal, which only emphasizes my point further.
Yeah.
Why was Tolkien more influential on metal than with his somewhat more morally rigid viewpoint, even communicated in his story to some extent, although I'd argue that his story is more nuanced than that. But just for the sake of discussion, yeah, why was he more influential on metal than writers like Michael Moorcock?
Well, weirdly, like, I mentioned how the explicit references in the 80s aren't really there for Tolkien so much. I mean, Moorcock is more so. Like, Cirith Ungol, in large part because of the album covers, but also because of a few songs. And I think when I brought this up with Rob Garvin, he kind of protested a little bit and said, we've done songs about other stuff. I've probably written as much about Lovecraft as anyone else. But, like, Elric of Melbourne, I mean, I can't think of Cirith Ungol without thinking about that character. It's so, with especially Michael Whalen's illustrations of him being so prominently used with Cirith Ungol. And then, of course, pre-Motorhead with Hawkwind, that Michael Moorcock was a major, major factor of that band. The fact that he did some voice narration and even wrote some lyrics for that band, and how much Hawkwind, again, as a predecessor to things like Motorhead and everything, that fusion of music, hippie music that appealed to punks and later metalheads. In terms of why Moorcock, at least probably from the 90s onward, hasn't been as prevalent, although like we mentioned, Blind Guardian have done songs about him, and I think plenty of other power metal fantasy bands have too. I think it's because Moorcock was sort of a reaction to Tolkien, and in that was always going to be something that less people sort of focused on, in comparison to Tolkien, and that like the bread was already baked in terms of Tolkien's influence on D&D, for example, and sort of these wider ranges. And it also might have something to do with just sort of difficulties maybe Moorcock's work had in getting published and passed around as much as Lord of the Rings did. And that might have been just a bias of that sort of first come, first serve kind of thing.
I mean, I have my own somewhat. I have my own opinion on it because I've read both, and I enjoy Michael Moorcock's work. I enjoy the character of Elric of Melniboné in particular. Um, but at the same time, Michael Moorcock's work is much more, in some ways, personal than Tolkien's is, and so much more resembles what I think became modern fantasy proper. Um, you have a lot more focus on character development, on individual character emotional experiences, which is present in Lord of the Rings for sure. But I would say that perhaps the reason why Tolkien became, because while you're correct, Joseph, like with Carith Ungol and Hawkwind and also Blind Guardian, um, and several other bands, Michael Moorcock was explicitly referenced. Obviously, with what metal became later on, Tolkien's influence is nearly ubiquitous. Um, and I I would argue that it's perhaps oversimplified, but Tolkien, I think, may just be a better world builder than Michael Moorcock. Um, as
Yeah,
far
I think that's very fair in that I think Tolkien's status as a world builder, certainly in the fantasy world, I think that appeals to certainly people who kind of want to create their own narratives, in that it's such a big and expansive world that it piques the imagination of others to kind of figure their own stories within it.
I think that's an important point in terms of the very simplistic reading, particularly by the time you get to black metal, is bands basically just finding cool words in his work and either using it for a song or using it as their band name or whatever. But going deeper than that, it's that sense of completeness and, in particular, of age as well. Because in the Lord of the Rings, as Tyler was saying, at sort of at the very start of the episode, like um, it expands the universe and kind of it ties the kind of characters and arc of the Hobbit with this much wider mythology. And the book is like sprinkled with references to more ancient times that are unpacked in the Silmarillion. But you get this sense of age and size and scope that I think metal musicians of that generation found very appealing, and it's something they either consciously or unconsciously tried to replicate in their music. Like black metal specifically, the one fundamental way it differs from death metal to me is the implication of size through a more minimalist approach to writing riffs and putting a composition together. There's a lot of implied kind of size and scope and time as well within black metal, as opposed to death metal, which it could arguably have that as well, to some extent, depending on the band, but it's much more sort of mechanical and immediate in that sense, and sort of visceral in a lot of ways. And it does sort of track more the personal, because it is often about the individual's relationship to mortality. But I think, yeah, it's that lifting of the, I guess you could almost call it the atmosphere of Tolkien to some extent, over and above the idea that it's a morality tale. If you listen to interviews of Varg Vikernes, he's trying to play down his interest in like the tale of Lord of the Rings. He just sort of says I was just interested in like the evil characters and stuff. But I think he subconsciously kind of absorbed more than he let on, in terms of like trying to replicate that sense of mysticism that you get from Tolkien, because it is such a vast world that is often just implied within the text through various like songs and sort of references that the characters make.
Varg's interest in Tolkien is really interesting in several regards because, obviously he is influenced by tabletop role-playing gaming. I mean, he made his own system, and he explicitly said that one of the biggest influences on his tabletop role-playing gaming career was the Middle-earth fantasy role-playing game. Um, and he also makes explicit references to Tolkien oftentimes in his social media presence. I think he's had a Twitter profile or two named Gandalf the White.
Yeah.
His position, his more recent position on Tolkien is interesting, but also in some ways kind of I'd hate, people are going to probably jump on me for saying this because I've been an unabashed Burzum fan and made that known. It's silly. He definitely takes up like the kind of fascist attempt at appropriating Tolkien, trying to make it seem like Christianity was not really an influence. I think they've even tried to argue that he pretended to be Christian because it was expected of him, which my response to that would be, why would you pretend to be a Catholic in England during his time as a Christian? It's not a good way to make you blend into society during that point where Catholics were still kind of regarded as somewhat of a lower class. Um, but he kind of leans into that kind of perspective on Tolkien and looking at him as like a sort of modern exponent of traditional European values. Um, but that being said,
Yeah.
even
I mean,
even hmm? Go on. I'm
no,
sorry.
no, no. Go ahead. I have something definitely to add, but continue.
Even in Burzum's older material, like in Hivis Lisset Taras, if you're like reading the lyrics to Det Salming Gangvar, there is this really, I think, beautiful and poetic expression of the sense of awe and mysticism that can come from reflecting on a lost past in a kind of melancholic and introspective way, which I think is one of the explicit themes present in Tolkien's work as well. So could that intersection between that kind of emotional theme be a coincidence? Perhaps, but it also might be a case of kind of unconscious osmosis, if you will.
I think it, and now I think we're getting really into the 90s with black metal, and at a certain point we can mention power metal and how they looked at Tolkien. And since we're on the subject of Burzum, certainly let's continue that. I mean, there's also the simple fact that not just taking a name from Tolkien's mythos to use, which certainly there are quite a few bands that have done that. We don't have to discuss much about them because it really was just the name, but like Gorgoroth, in a very odd roundabout way, like the death metal band Amon Amarth, who had become sort of this Viking arena band, but Amon Amarth does come from Tolkien, and even something like Fenris's side project Isengard, and then even like the singer from Dimmu Borgir, when picking his black metal name, basically made a slightly changed version of an orc named Shagrath. And then, but with Burzum, it's interesting in that he's taken it from the language of Mordor, which is what is in literally, I think, the poem inscribed on the Ring of Power, because what was it, the Dark Speech? Because Burzum essentially translates to darkness, which is a key point in the poem, saying that in the darkness bind them. So that's where a very, very key part of the Lord of the Rings is essentially where the title Burzum comes from.
And on the debut as well, a track called "The Crying Orc." Just a very brief instrumental. That's a title that's always fascinated me.
And Grishnak, isn't that the name of an orc?
Yeah, it's the name of an orc from Lord of the Rings. Varg outright said in early interviews, I think before he kind of tried to distance himself from the idea of how much Tolkien influenced him, that he was very influenced by Tolkien in his early work, and that he was influenced in the way that he thought, I think to put it really simply, he thought the sides of like Sauron and Mordor were cool, and that they represented like ancient Norse society, and that the good side in Lord of the Rings was more so like Christian Europe. And so he wanted to create a mythos within Burzum that somewhat glorified like the bad guys in Lord of the Rings, so to speak, which he thought were unfairly maligned as the bad guys. I think that was somewhat of a motivation for him in Burzum.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, again, like the appeal of like power metal and black metal in different ways. For black metal, it's sort of the atmosphere and energy of this very detailed world of darkness that coexists with this world of light. And it's detailed in a way that, like, if you look at black metal using sort of the satanic narratives, the Bible doesn't mention that much about the devil or Satan, and the fact that it's somewhat ironic that even a lot of the narratives we have of the dark side of Christianity mostly comes from later works such as Dante's Inferno or Paradise Lost, which have no real relevance to any of the theology per se. But even to this day, when we see movies and stuff that talk about Satan and Lucifer, a lot of the tropes or character traits we have of that come from those works. And instead, in Lord of the Rings, you get a much more kind of mythologized notion of these entities of darkness and evil and corruption. Certainly Sauron, and then even one who becomes corrupted like Saruman. And then, you get into the Silmarillion with the big bad of Morgoth. And even that's sort of an interesting dynamic when, you kind of realize compared to, I think a lot of people brought up in a Christian household, and then, you read Sauron and you think, oh, okay, he's like the great evil one, so he's like sort of like the devil or something. And then you realize he's really just the lieutenant of what was the big bad evil, which I think is an interesting little twist, especially when you come from sort of a Christian upbringing and then really dive into the mythos of Lord of the Rings. So I think it's very appealing to the black metal world in that it's a very fleshed out and deep world of darkness to play with. And very interesting, connected to how Varg in his tabletop and role-playing gaming found an appeal for that. I think very much because he was friends with and did a lot of that, and I think even the, LARPing stuff that I think he even mentioned doing, did that with a lot of the guys in Immortal, since they used to be bandmates. And Immortal took that very much and did their own thing. As anyone who knows Immortal, they created their own sort of mythos and their own sort of fantasy realm of Blackish Reich, rather than just pulling from Tolkien. But it's very clear that influence of D&D and role-playing and probably the darker side of Tolkien helped create for them what they thought Blackish Reich would be.
Yeah, again, it's that sense of Tolkien both presenting you a totally complete realized world, but also it encourages people to explore their own imagination and create their own equivalent fantasy world. Belisario, did you want to come in on the connection with black metal? Not necessarily Burzum or specifically, but the connection with Tolkien and black metal at all.
Oh, yes. I wanted to mention first that I find very interesting that many bands from different genres of metal can find inspiration in Tolkien. You got the likes of power metal, for example, like you said, Blind Guardian or other bands taking the brighter side of the Tolkien world as an inspiration, and then black metal taking the dark side, and apparently there is no contradiction. There is room enough for both. And what I find interesting about the black metal bands is they take everything bad and evil from Tolkien world, as was expected. But they're fascinated by the figure of Sauron, while Sauron is not the almighty deity you can think of, because it's more like another metaphor for Satan, I will say, in Middle-earth, because he's powerful but not so much. He's all the time afraid that he's going to be overthrown, and he's afraid even by a hobbit which carries a ring, and he's all the time troubled by things that can go wrong, and eventually he's beaten by the smallest of creatures. And so you can really relate to him in a way as metal bands or metalheads relate to Satan, because it's the rebellious that ends up being defeated. And so there is a bit to say about that, I think.
Yeah, it's the fallen angel thing again, is that, Satan ultimately kind of lost his battle, and he is the antagonist at all times, but he's also more relatable than the absolute perfection of God in a lot of ways. I guess we should probably also bring it round to summoning, who are somewhat anomalous in terms of how much they lean into Tolkien. I think they were one of the first metal bands to basically build their entire like aesthetic and music around his work, but also anomalous in the fact that they at the time didn't sound like any other black metal band. Not just the sort of obvious stuff that by the second album they were using a drum machine, they were using keyboards more as a lead instrument. They were also, perhaps as a result of them being so absorbed into Tolkien's world, much brighter. They were much more comfortable playing with the more heroic aspects of the Middle Earth mythos, and but still kind of remaining true to the underlying kind of sense of mysticism and awe that black metal attempts to kind of convey to the listener. And it's fascinating as well that they've managed to tread that line for so long across many different albums and explore it from lots of different angles. As their music has developed, they've picked up on different parts of the lore. They've found different ways to express it, but it's always very recognizably summoning. And I think what it gets across, as I was saying earlier, is that sense of age and majesty and the open expanse of the world, but also kind of humanizing it to some extent. They make you feel like you yourself are partaking in the events and kind of traversing different sort of landscapes across Middle Earth and different situations and so on. They're very good at sort of placing the listener within a world, whereas a lot of other black metal bands, as we discussed, some of it really was just as simple as that sounds cool, I'm going to use that name or whatever. But the approach to Tolkien is a lot more kind of, as Tyler was saying with Burzum, for instance, it's a bit kind of hesitant almost, in that Varg seems to be a little bit embarrassed about it at times and then tries to justify it by claiming that Tolkien was not religious or whatever. Whereas, summoning sort of much more just helpful ever, just diving into the world, and inspired a bunch of kind of late blooming copycat bands such as Emin Meal and I don't know how to pronounce it, Caledon Brood, based on entirely different fantasy series. But yeah, it's a very kind of interesting direction that they took it, and I am kind of surprised that there wasn't another sort of newer generation of black metal bands attempting to build more firmly on what they did, not necessarily with the Tolkien stuff, but also just the idea of melding fantasy metal with black metal in that way that's quite subtle and dignified, but also not afraid to be quite bright and almost life-affirming in a way that black metal doesn't tend to be.
Yeah, I think one thing with that, well, the one, there's also just kind of a historically placed reason for why summoning went the route they did in terms of their themes. I think they've mentioned a few times in interviews that basically Abigor kind of was at the same time with very similar shared members. And I think they wanted to differentiate between the bands. And Abigor was very much established as sort of using satanic themes. So they were like, okay, well, with this other band, we really don't want to just do the same thing. So let's find something else. And the world of Middle Earth and Tolkien was what they found on. And I think it was very much not, sticking with that was also to continue to very clearly delineate between what was Abigor material and summoning material.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. And I should also probably mention the sort of germinal dungeon synth connection by this point. Although it wasn't called that at the time. I know all about it now because I've read a lovely book that I'm sure you've read my review of. Anyway, I won't go into that. Yeah, the summoning were very much closely linked to this sort of loose conglomerate of black metal adjacent artists that were doing what we now call dungeon synth, but there was a very obvious crossover with them lifting a lot of inspiration from Tolkien as well, and that bled into summoning's kind of music to a greater extent. And again, it's that kind of that ethos of letting your imagination go to some extent and just kind of seeing where it takes you. And I think that's kind of that's what you get is something like summoning from that in terms of how deep they can go into Tolkien's world and kind of align their music with it. Should we talk about Nightfall in Middle Earth then?
Yeah,
Unless anyone else wants to come in on the summoning and black metal, anything I've missed.
Summoning is really interesting, I think, in regards to talking about the influence of Tolkien on metal via world building, because that's essentially all they do with references to him. They are simultaneously one of the ones that reference him most explicitly, but also at the same time don't necessarily reference him in a way that is all too relevant per se to plot, which is something that I think Blind Guardian does much more so, that we can talk about with Nightfall and Middle Earth. But what Summoning does, I believe, is really do a good job at creating the sense of just an expanse of a place to explore, a place that is not limited by the boundaries of modern society, by sprawling cities and rigid rules and technology that kind of seem to micromanage every aspect of our existence. I think that when you're looking at a song like one of my particular favorites by them, even though I feel their best work is their first two or so albums, is the song Balerion from Oathbound, which to me almost perfectly captures the feeling I had of reading about the Lay of Beleriand and the Silmarillion when I was 11 or 12 years old, sitting on my windowsill, reading that book while it was raining outside, and having all these visions through my head of just an endless sea of green trees that I was walking through as I was imagining the various landmarks of those lands. I think that it's one of the reasons why I think that band is just so absolutely captivating.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's also a personal favorite of mine. But yeah, as I was kind of hinting at at the top of the episode, like the difference between heavy and power metal's treatment of Tolkien and black metal's, and like, in this way, summoning art more typical is it's much more of like almost like a spiritual and conceptual connection, whereas heavy metal and power metal bands are very uh, keen to convey the kind of nuts and bolts of the narratives themselves. They're very interested in, and this is sort of typical of the genre as well. It's very interested in heroes' journeys and the individual overcoming events and the struggle and so on. Whereas black metal's more interested in the feel of the world and how it makes the individual feel to actually live and sort of be confronted with these things, and that sense of scale as well. It's much sort of vaguer and open-ended, I suppose, and I think that's why it's always resonated with me more. Bella, sorry, do you have anything to... Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I definitely have a further comment before we end Summoning, but yeah, Belisario, if you want to add in first.
Oh, I pretty much agree with what you said. I think the Summoning is more about sonic landscape painting, more than explicit mentioning of deeds or narration. And in this regard, they found the perfect niche in Tolkien works. And I guess, if I recall correctly, in the discography at the beginning, they didn't set out in the demos for Middle Earth, but then it came shortly thereafter, and they have an album with lyrics relating to Moorcock, if I remember correctly. But then most of their stuff is Middle Earth based, because it's the perfect match for what they're doing musically. And maybe it hasn't been copied so much because it's difficult to do the same thing as Summoning without being a mere copycat, I guess. There's not... If you want to be inspired by Summoning and do something original, I guess it would come out quite different from what they do.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought whether it would be something in the realm of like Summoning or more like the folk Viking stuff of Bathory, but there are other fantasy worlds that I would certainly be very interested to see a band really kind of envelop itself in. Like, the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, especially outside of just the major plot points, I think would be a really interesting one to see black metal or some sort of atmospheric metal play with. There's quite a few very interesting fantasy realms with that. But with summoning, another major aspect of black metal, of course, besides the evil and darkness, is that sort of spiritual connection to nature, the sort of paganism or pantheism aspect that's always kind of been associated, especially since the 90s, with a number of bands. And I think summoning definitely tap into that and show kind of how the Middle Earth realm as a very explicit place where the spiritual or magical, mysterious could be existing just past the next tree. And especially for a lot of kind of geeky metalhead guys who really love going hiking, that's super appealing, and very much something that one can romanticize and enjoy in your one's daily commune with nature.
Now that you mention this Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire thing, I was doing some research for this episode, and I was thinking about the lots of metal bands that are about Tolkien, and I did a quick search on Metal Archives with a lyrical theme Tolkien. I got 300 results, which if you type Lovecraft, you get 500. But then for Game of Thrones, you get 1. And I guess there is an explanation for that, because as much as I like also A Song of Ice and Fire, I think it's not so fit for metal because it's too modern, too dirty, I don't know, in a way. While for the other ones, for Tolkien and Lovecraft, is pure mythology, and to my view, this fits more with what metal tends to.
I think we may get more in the future. I mean, the other thing is, I think there's probably, like with Moorcock and some others, there's not so many bands who pure focus on it. But I mean, even Blind Guardian have done a song or two about the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, and there are definitely some other bands who have. So I think it's there. But yeah, for whatever reason, unlike Tolkien and maybe unlike a few other things, there hasn't been a band that's dedicated either a full album or their whole thematic legacy to it.
I think that kind of like with what I said about Michael Moorcock, although I think this is even more so the case with A Song of Ice and Fire, I think that it's somewhat too personal for a lot of metal. A lot of A Song of Ice and Fire is about like the personal emotional reactions to certain events happening, which is why I think that it's so appealing to people who are part of, I guess, more of the general populace, why they can connect with it and find it so interesting, even though they're normally watching, I don't know, action films and rom-coms, is because it has a similar kind of storytelling atmosphere to those action films and rom-coms, where it's very focused on the individual and their emotional experiences. And I think sometimes metal has a hard time connecting to that kind of story.
Do you think that has to do with the main books? Because obviously, Martin's done other books that kind of talk about more the lore and kind of background, which I think in some ways would help inspire more metal artists to write songs about that. But like the major Song of Ice and Fire books are told from like sort of a diary first person perspective.
Yeah, I think it's probably those ones that that probably have that kind of approach the most. I mean, obviously Game of Thrones, the televised series, was the one that I think was most popular amongst people.
Well, yes, of course.
And that was based on those books. I think that when you're looking at things like some of the prequel novels, like A Dance of Dragons and things, and it's mention of like long distant wars that had, I think those things might be somewhat more appealing to a heavy metal perspective. God,
could you imagine like a band like Immortal writing songs about the Night King? I think it'd be perfect.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That would be a little bit more fitting. It's just, so much of what people say they like about either Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire is like Jaime Lannister's character development. And I just don't think that's something that metalheads are going to connect to that much,
Well, yeah, I'm holding out for black metal bands writing about the Night King or writing about like all the darkness that lurks in Ashai, in a lot of these places. That because the other thing that I find fascinating with the Song of Ice and Fire, and let's leave this after this because we're definitely diving away from Tolkien, but how, you know, he clearly is taking influence from Tolkien, but at the same time, in a same way as Moorcock, kind of making a commentary on Tolkien and kind of going, well, you know, what if this happened with real human psychology and was maybe a little less mythological? But at the same time, he's pulling in influences like Lovecraft, like the whole way the Song of Ice and Fire deals with notion of deities and the mystical, I think is really fascinating.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think my last comment on it would be actually talking about this in relation to metal and metal's morality, so to speak, as contrasted with Tolkien's conservatism and kind of more rigidly moral viewpoint.
Yeah.
Is I mentioned this earlier in the episode that I wanted to touch on this about how there's more nuance to the common perspective that George R. R. Martin has even at times said he's had of Tolkien of it's too morally simplistic. The good guys win, the bad guys lose. No one dies, and it has a happy ending. And I've always asked people, does Lord of the Rings have a happy ending? Is it happy that that Sam and Frodo, who are best friends, are tragically ripped apart, not because
it's a melancholic ending, I think.
Right, yeah, and essentially ripped apart because Frodo's suffering from deep-seated trauma.
Yeah,
you know,
like severe. I mean, he goes to the Western Lands because he essentially has uncurable PTSD.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I don't think that it's entirely. Is it a happy ending in a sense? Yes. I don't think it's entirely accurate to paint it as a happy ending in the way that you see in like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Well, yeah, it's like that loss of innocence, isn't it? It's like you've gone through so much that you can't go back to your life as it was. It's sort of almost, you could almost read it as a tale about maturing and losing your childhood wonder.
Of course, the other thing with Martin and other realms of that, like Martin obviously is also including medieval history into it. I mean, obviously, like one of the biggest influences on Game of Thrones is the War of the Roses, with the Yorks and Lancasters.
Yeah, I was going to say there's that element where it's not just personal, it's the political intrigue and all of the kind of Machiavellian moves.
And I think that's the main thing he's talked about Tolkien is that sort of like the politics realm doesn't really come into Lord of the Rings. Like the political divisions maybe between the orcs aren't discussed, and the political divisions between, you know, the elves and the humans aren't really discussed.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, obvious answer is that Tolkien wasn't particularly interested in communicating that.
Yeah.
As a random aside, talking about the War of the Roses, my best friend's wife's her mother's maiden name is Lancaster and has direct genetic descent from that family. So she was like, yeah, if history had gone right, yeah, she was like, if history had gone a little differently, I might be nobility. But
or she, well, and yeah, and what kind of nobility?
Right. But yeah, I always thought that was funny. But yeah, nice. I think the political stuff is interesting too because I like reading history, and when I read history, I read it very differently than I read something like Tolkien. I read it because I'm interested in all of the technical minutia, and in that regard, Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire can be very interesting because it kind of scratches that itch.
Yeah, I mean, because that's sort of the added bonus of sort of all the drama, the human drama, especially when you look at the medieval realm, where a lot of it was family versus family, whether it's, you know, these almost Civil War-like battles in the United Kingdom or something like the warring states of Italy. Like I just watched something about the Medicis and this whole like incident that happened with like the Pope's blessing for an assassination, and it's crazy stuff. But anyway, getting back, last thing I wanted to mention with summoning is there was an interview with the members in 2018 on a website called Ave Noctem, and Silenus was asked about like why did they kind of use the world of Middle Earth, and he mentioned obviously the Abergor thing, but he had a really, really great couple of lines here, and I just wanted to quote him. So this is from Silenus. He says, It all began with the huge inspiration I drew from his books, meaning Tolkien, in the early 90s, and I had a clear concept of how the music should sound to make a kind of musical painting of different locations or events within this world. I think the key is that the music should not only sound epic and bombastic, but I think the feeling of wanderlust and this special kind of wistfulness are very important to integrate into our music. These are feelings I strongly remember from when I read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
I think that speaks to what Tyler keeps mentioning in terms of the human and personal element that the sort of mass audience would find appealing. And what they sometimes struggle with in Lord of the Rings is that for very long passages, he's just describing the landscape and he's just describing literally the physical world that the characters are moving through. And for long periods, you're just getting long exposition of different terrain, the natural fauna and whatever, which again, yeah, summoning is kind of, you can see that in the just listening to the music is that sense of journey as well as scale. That there's not really like a central narrative thread. It's not sort of a lyrical kind of flow to the music. It is much more like laid back and sort of landscapey, I suppose, which does really speak to that element of Tolkien in particular.
Tolkien had a really interesting essay in which he expounded on the difference between literature and drama. And he mentioned how in literature you can do things like describe in detail the significance or the appearance of trees because it's expected when you're reading literature that you're going to be reading words. So taking time to explain things in words doesn't betray the medium, so to speak. It doesn't make the reader wonder why they're reading, to be redundant. Whereas in drama, if you have very long parts of exposition, there's a bit of the expectation of, I'm here to watch something. Why are you talking to me so much? um, you know, and he, mentions how because of that, you almost have to, in drama, heavily anthropomorphize things in order to be able to uh, create something that visually expresses what the piece is hoping to communicate, if that makes sense. Um, I think that kind of relates to music as well. And I know that certain reviewers have even touched before. I mean, Jason would probably leap all over this with Schopenhauer talking about this, about how uh, music kind of has the potential to have almost no subtext at all. You know, um, it's really interesting, I think, in connection to summoning talking about wanting to just create landscapes with their music, so to speak. In that, with music, you almost even more so than literature, you can have entire pieces focused on the beauty of something that almost doesn't have a human element at all, like a forest.
Yeah, and I think that again that speaks to how metal initially distinguished itself from rock, but also by the time you get to black metal in the 90s that we're talking about now, it even goes deeper than that in a way, in that we've removed any semblance of like humanity from it, and we're just talking about the experience of sort of being in nature, and kind of the sort of grandeur of it and how it sort of confronts the individual. And again, it's not. I think that's what a lot of people that aren't into metal kind of sometimes struggle with. In that, and I'm not sort of being judgmental on this, but a lot of people go to music for some sort of emotional catharsis or to kind of work through or experience someone else sort of expressing personal emotions related to either specific events or specific feelings, in the sort of, I guess, an equivalent way to what a drama would be. Whereas a metalhead will likely turn to music to experience something other than their immediate surroundings. And black metal takes it to sort of the most extreme degree, not just musically, but also philosophically, in terms of just completely removing yourself from yourself, almost in like a meditative way. And for that reason, it often gets sort of categorized as kind of vulgar and escapist in a similar way to what people would do with Tolkien. But actually, it's a very kind of, it's not better or worse. It's just we're turning to music for a very different reason, I suppose, which is why we end up getting these very obsessive discussions about it, because we're not just sort of throwing it on casually to have something in the background or kind of just something nice to listen to. We're actually looking for something a little bit deeper from it, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's more complex. Obviously, a lot of black metal is very simple, but what it's conveying on top of that is slightly more. I mean, I hate to use the word, but slightly more profound, I suppose, in a lot of ways. Belisari, do you have any thoughts on that at all? Or?
Oh, I do agree with that. I think metal and Tolkien works have in common that the fact that it's not casual escapism is, like, you could say, heavy escapism. Like, you go to an entire different world and you take everything a bit too seriously, maybe, but it fulfills you a lot in a way that many other people cannot understand.
And one thing, adding with Summoning, I quickly looked over the album covers. The artwork that accompanies Summoning very much sort of further reflects their attitude and perspective. You look at the album covers, and it's essentially always some landscape setting that feels like would be right in Middle Earth, some sort of grand piece of architecture, usually within some as well grand piece of geography, or if there's any animate creature, it's a dragon, which is also very much a kind of elemental type of mythological figure.
Yeah, it's interesting that, actually, because you're right in describing it like that, and just contrasting it with, I know we keep talking about this album, but contrasting it with Blind Guardian's Nightfall in Middle-earth, which is a specific scene involving Morgoth from the Silmarillion, I believe, which, again, even just comparing that with, say, the cover of Stronghold or whatever, you can already tell the different musical experiences that you're going to get in terms of the interest of one band is very much the experience and the landscape and the environment. The interest of the other, for that album at least, is very much the stories themselves, and they want to convey the narrative and express it through more the kind of, I don't say nuts and bolts, but like the specifics of the stories of Tolkien, beyond just the environment itself. And it's interesting that's conveyed just by comparing the cover art itself before you've even hit play.
Well, and on that note, I think we can dive into Blind Guardian for a little bit. So if, and given our listenership, there might be quite a few people who haven't really listened to them or much power metal. Blind Guardian, as we kind of mentioned before, probably the band in power metal most associated with Tolkien, and particularly because of Nightfall in Middle-earth, though they, even from the very first Blind Guardian album, had songs about Middle-earth, Majesty being one of their earliest big hits in particular. They also have a song, kind of a play on the major Ring poem called Lord of the Rings. And a few other ones. They have the Bard song, The Hobbit, obviously about the Hobbit. But yeah, so they had a few already leading up to which is their sixth album, I think, sixth or seventh, which would be Nightfall in Middle-earth, where they decided to write an entire concept album taking major story parts, not the entirety of the book, but some major parts of the Silmarillion, which is sort of this, and Tyler can speak quite a bit more on that, prequel / sort of larger mythological basis for what would be in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which, if you dive deep into this, essentially Tolkien has the realm of Middle-earth having gone through 3 ages. The Silmarillion mostly dealing with the first age, and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings being part of what is this third age, which is a few thousand years later.
About 3,000 years after the Silmarillion.
Yeah. And specifically Nightfall in Middle Earth, dealing with, I think it begins with one of Morgoth's battles where he loses. And the album's interesting because it has full fleshed out songs, but then it has a number of sort of either instrumental or narrative, almost sort of like a book on tape kind of interlude tracks where it adds this sort of cinematic or dramatic quality to it, really kind of fleshing out further as a concept album in the same way that, like, if you listen to a King Diamond album, it has those sort of flourishes of kind of sounds like a radio play almost. In terms of the story of what Nightfall in Middle Earth is dealing with, I believe it starts off mostly talking about Morgoth's conflict with Ungoliant after the destruction of the two trees, and then struggling to possess the Silmarils later. Then deals with sort of the fight between the elves and Morgoth, especially with Fëanor and the Noldor. And then I think kind of like halfway through the album, which is one of the major ones, some of the big tracks like Mirror Mirror is about the building of Gondolin, and then the song Time Stands Still at the Iron Hill is about the elf Fingolfin's fight with Morgoth.
That's an awesome fight.
Yeah.
The Mirror Mirror is actually about the crossing of Fingolfin and his people across the Helcaraxe, the bridge of ice that connects Valinor to Beleriand at the time, because when Fingolfin's people and Feanor's people attack the Teleri, who dwell on the shores of Valinor and are master shipbuilders, to seize their ships, Feanor and his people cross into Beleriand across the sea. First, there's not enough room to carry everyone on board, and promise that they'll send the ships back over to take Fingolfin and his people, which is a huge deal because what they just did is going to put them into a position of being judged by the Valar, the gods of Middle Earth, so to speak, for their wrongdoing. So if Fingolfin and his people stay, they're going to have to suffer that judgment. And Feanor, being an asshole of epic proportions, decides to burn the ships instead. And at this time in Tolkien's mythos, the world is flat. So the elf Fingolfin and his people can see across the ocean to where the ships are being burned in Beleriand and know they've been betrayed, and they don't want to face the judgment of the Valar, so they decide to cross the Helcaraxe, which is a very brutal trek across frozen ice. And many of people, including Fingolfin's wife, if I remember correctly, die along the way. But they manage to make it across. And despite the hardships they suffer, become one of the more powerful elven factions in Middle Earth. So I think the song is supposed to be a testament to the heroic leadership of Fingolfin and the resilience of his people in doing that. But yeah, the Nightfall in Middle Earth covers most of the major narrative tales because the Silmarillion is kind of a collection of sagas or tales. It covers the fall of Gondolin. It covers the tale of Beren and Luthien. It covers to some extent, the War of Wrath. And it also covers, what's the other major narrative tale in there? I think that's pretty much about all of it. There's some smaller tales it covers, like what was it? It covers a little bit just like the Noldor's position in general, their guilt that they suffer for what they did. And so on and so forth, because unlike in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, to listeners who may not be familiar with the Silmarillion, where the elves are either whimsical or mysterious and wise, the elves in the Silmarillion are largely terrible people. Just awful, kin slaughtering murderous people. um, it's pretty shocking almost when you read it, the difference there.
Well, and I guess, if you were to talk to Tolkien about it, he would say sort of like the Silmarillion is sort of, as a species, as it were, that's the elves' childhood days. Like they're before kind of becoming sort of too old and wise for this world as they eventually become by the Third Age. So they're just making mistakes left and right.
Oh, absolutely. Pretty terrible ones as well. Yeah, and but yeah, Blind Guardian definitely focuses more on kind of the personal element to some extent. Um, I don't think they do it in a way that is bad, so to speak. In fact, I enjoy it. I really like the album Nightfall in Middle Earth. It's interesting that that album in particular is not only pretty much the only album Blind Guardian has solely dedicated to a single story, but was also, to some extent, if I remember correctly, the album that kind of put them on the map to the extent that they are today.
Yeah, they well, and it was actually their that was the proper introduction I had to them. I think it was around that time they got a deal with Virgin Records, at least to distribute them. So they certainly got more attention. I think certainly they had always been really big in Germany, and I mean, kind of how the power metal world worked in the 90s, despite the more alternative leaning music. I think in Germany and Central Europe, power metal, in Sweden, power metal always still did pretty well. But it's around the time, and it didn't hurt that I think within a year after of Nightfall Middle Earth coming out, the Jackson movies were released, which again, it made anyone who was like, I need to get something, anything that has to do with Lord of the Rings, boom, that album was right there, not even that terribly old. So I think that was, and they made that album, I think, not even fully being aware that the Jackson movies were coming out. So it was just sort of ominously good timing on their part.
Yeah,
For me,
and oh, go on.
no,
I'm
no, go
sorry.
ahead, go ahead.
Just personal anecdote. When I was about 12 years old or so, I heard on the Windows Media Player radio station for metal, which I was checking out kind of in a semi-rebellious way. Like, I'd always heard that metal was scary and bad and evil and would influence you to do bad things. And a part of me wasn't interested in the sense that I wanted to get into it, but was interested in, like, is it really that bad? I want to see for myself. And I turned it on, and the first song that came on was "Into the Storm" from Nightfall and Middle Earth. Um, and me being really into Tolkien and fantasy stuff, I was immediately taken by it. I almost didn't want to admit that I was, because I was a bit fearful that my parents would be upset that I was getting into heavy metal. Um, but I was, yeah, almost immediately taken by it. And so Blind Guardian and Nightfall and Middle Earth in particular is somewhat to credit for me getting into the genre. It didn't really blossom until about 3 to 4 years later, when I got into extreme metal and then fully dived into the music, but they set the groundwork.
Yeah, actually, definitely have a little bit of an anecdote with them, and it's partially the reason why I'm not the biggest power metal fan, and really, like, I could probably point to like 4, maybe 5 bands that I still particularly care about, and they were ones I've been listening to for quite a while. But in part of that, I think, is Blind Guardian is a quite good band, in that, unlike some power metal bands, especially ones that came later, they were also still very rooted in a lot of the speed and thrash metal that they came from, and at the same time had sort of a songwriting sensibility not too dissimilar from Iron Maiden. And again, the whole sort of not being too pigeonholed in one thing. Like, you can listen to Blind Guardian and you'll hear a song that's about a Moorcock book, and then you'll hear a song that's about a Stephen King book, which I always thought was interesting, because if you look at Stephen King and heavy metal, it's like the two big towers of that are Anthrax and Blind Guardian. I think have done more songs about Stephen King stories than anyone else. But then, Blind Guardian's most associated with Lord of the Rings. But for me, when I was getting into metal, like I heard Metallica and a lot of the older bands, and at the same time, that was when nu metal was such a big thing, like the very late 90s, very early 2000s. So my first impression with metal was that most of the contemporary metal was this thing I did not like, that there was no guitar solos, there was not really much of a focus on melody or, as we discussed previously, more harmonic kind of playing. That it was more sort of percussive and more thematically rooted with sort of a modern angst. And I was actually alienated from that. I didn't really relate to it, especially compared to, I guess, being, a geeky kid like Iron Maiden doing songs about Dune and, Icarus. That was more appealing to me. Or, Metallica having songs about Lovecraft or, the plagues in Egypt. So finally, though, a friend of mine turned me on to Demons and Wizards. That and I think, oddly, Nightwish and Savatage. At the same time. And that was my first introduction to more contemporary metal that actually sounded and seemed in any way actually related or descended from like the Metallicas and the Iron Maidens and Judas Priest I was listening to. And then discovering that, Demons and Wizards is actually half Blank Guardian, half Iced Earth. So when I went looking for Blank Guardian, first album I got at the record shop was the CD for Nightfall Middle Earth, and that started it from Blank Guardian for me. And yeah, very much fell in love with that, and was already someone who I think I had been primed in that my exposure to Lord of the Rings, I'd read some of the books. I think my parents had gotten the books on tape for me, and I had listened to those over and over. And, if we got to talk about the Peter Jackson stuff, but before that, I actually very clearly remember watching the Lord of the Rings cartoons and the Hobbit cartoon. The Lord of the Rings one made by Ralph Bakshi in a very kind of weird way.
It's fucking great. I love that.
Oh yeah. It's just like such a piece of cult cinema. But both of those playing a big part in my attachment to the world of Middle Earth. And then I was very primed to fall in love with Nightfall and Middle Earth from Blind Guardian.
Bella, sorry, do you have any thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, I think there is a point to be made as to Blind Guardian being a really good band that maybe many people just acquainted with extreme metal don't really know, because I think they're discussed mostly as European typical power metal, while I think they are much above average, and their albums are really great, and they got a nice evolution also. In time, they became some kind of mix between speed metal and a band like Queen, but in a good way, I would say, like taking the best of both worlds. So there is a case to be made as Blind Guardian being a good band, even for black metal fans, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always felt... I mean, they came... The funny thing, especially with the relation between power metal and black metal, because they actually changed their name to Blind Guardian from... They used to be called Lucifer's Heritage in their demo days. And they changed it because they were worried they were going to get associated with the burgeoning 80s first wave of black metal. And again, connected with Tolkien, I think Hansi is Catholic and a number of the other guys in the band are Catholic. So I think they were always a little wary of people thinking they were satanic in any way. Although obviously Tom Araya has a similar story of that, though he didn't mind sticking with that subject matter, at least for a little while. So it's an interesting dynamic where even in the very beginnings, because of how nebulous speed metal was and kind of having its foot in so many different places, at a certain point they very much delineated themselves away from the more black metal satanic side of it. But yeah, when you listen to their albums in development, and especially the few leading up to Nightfall Middle Earth, like musical developments, like I would very much compare it in the way like Metallica developed from Kill 'Em All to Master of Puppets and Injustice for All, like becoming more sort of progressive, kind of more not just pure speed, a band very much focusing on atmosphere and many different type of musical developments, dark and light, and pulling in lots of different influences. I mean, everything from Queen and probably like Led Zeppelin to stuff like the British band Satan, who, they actually famously covered, like I actually heard Satan's track, God, what is it? The first one on the first album. But I actually heard Blind Guardian's cover of that before I actually heard Satan's. So I think as a band within the wider metal scene, Blind Guardian has been, and for good reason, has been a really good crossover band for people who don't necessarily like power metal. Like, they're different in that way from like something like Stratovarius or Rhapsody or something like that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that as someone that approaches it from the extreme metal angle, and not finding power metal that appealing. But yeah, I think it was imagination from the other side that I was actually getting into. But yeah, it's sort of a good way to get your foot in the door. We're going to wrap up soon because we're nearly at the 2-hour mark. But we've kind of, I guess we're at the point in the story where the Peter Jackson films are about to come out, and their timing is kind of serendipitous, not just for Blind Guardian, but I think for just metal and geek culture in general, not just because they were very formative for me in terms of I was getting into metal around the time that they came out, and it kind of all came together very nicely, but also the fact that they obviously exploded the popularity of Lord of the Rings once again to a mass audience that although Tolkien was already, one of the best-selling authors of the 20th century, it was just sort of brought it to a much wider audience that wouldn't necessarily be interested in fantasy, the fantasy genre in general. But also the fact that, I mean, Joseph, you were mentioning like metal at the time, running up to when sort of Blind Guardian were releasing some of their best work in the 90s. Metal was much more what's the word? Jockey, I suppose. It was more like, Pantera, the solos had kind of disappeared. Things were much more based in sort of...
But definitely the new metal, like, I mean, the burgeoning Korn, Slipknot.
Yeah, the sort of alt metal, new metal thing was kind of the popular thing. I know 90s was also the decade of black metal and to some extent death metal, but metal was kind of shedding its relationship to fantasy in general and becoming much more of a sort of alternative rock genre. And I don't want to sort of attribute too much to the films in terms of its influence over metal music, but they were very formative to the mainstreaming of geek culture in general, that I mentioned earlier on in terms of the 2010s, obviously the Marvel films as well, but Game of Thrones as well, the TV series played a big role in that. And whether it's cause and effect or not, or just correlation, the fact that metal did become popular again to some extent, not in a mainstream way, but there was an explosion of fans sort of getting into metal from, backgrounds and personality types that weren't necessarily typical for a metal audience. And I think metal also rediscovered it's not to be kind of ashamed of itself to some extent. By that I mean that the sort of more typical metal like affectations of very, very unapologetically ambitious songwriting, very complex songwriting, the return of virtuoso solos, indulging in fantasy literature to some extent, rediscovering its kind of exploration of religion and all of that. Whether you think there's actually been much quality music to come out of that is kind of by the by. I think it's sort of it does speak to a sort of newer generation rediscovering Tolkien's world. And just to follow up on Belisario's point earlier on about searching on metal archives for lyrical themes, I was actually thinking we'll probably do an episode on this somewhere down the line in terms of the comparison with something like sci-fi, in that there is a lot of metal bands that lift material from sci-fi, like Voivod and Nocturnus being the two obvious ones that come to mind. But I was just doing searches on Dune, the Dune book series, and there were only 9 bands that come up, and then I searched Asimov and there are only 2 bands, and I just thought that was quite curious because Dune seems to be a sort of comparable sci-fi novel in terms of the scope of its kind of world and complexity that I would have thought there'd be more. But yeah, it's interesting that kind of at that time, just sort of in the years after the Lord of the Rings films come out, like metal comes much more at ease with itself, and I think you can kind of almost take the temperature of how confident metal is feeling by how many bands are kind of still lifting from not necessarily just Tolkien, but like the fantasy aesthetic in general. And yeah, you still see it crop up a lot in this day and age. We're kind of at the tail end of the popularity of geek culture now. I think it's sort of going back into more of an alternative sort of pursuit, but that might just be a vibe that I'm kind of picking up on there. Any other?
One comment on that. I think an interesting dynamic that the films did was, oddly, even though they mainstreamed the stories in a way that no other media adaptation had, they kind of brought more respect in academic circles to Tolkien's work than I think before. I think it had also been kind of reached a certain amount of time and space where I think probably certain much older critics and academics kind of dying off, and then some of the young fans from the 60s and 70s now becoming kind of the older guard in academia. I think it was just kind of the time for Tolkien's work to start getting taken serious. And also the fact that now that so many people knew about it in a mainstream sense, now actually going back and reading the books became a more sort of geeky / academic pursuit. And as well, maybe something where, like, you know, around the time or not too late after, like something like Harry Potter becoming one of the more famous fantasy works, and people kind of going, oh, well, that's just kind of, you know, blah stuff. Like, if you want to get into real fantasy, check out Lord of the Rings. Because I do think around the time of the 2000s, you start getting, like, Lord of the Rings courses taught in colleges with a certain degree of seriousness.
It's an interesting sort of pop culture academic crossover in that one of the things the films do really well is respecting the source material and showing a great deal of knowledge about the source material and how to convey it, but also making a film that appeals to someone that knows nothing about Tolkien and has never touched the books.
And the other thing, which even the animated movies did, like if you go back in the casting of it, like I'll never forget the Hobbit one, which, you know, is not the greatest piece of cinema, but I do have quite a bit of fondness for it. And I think the animation is, especially compared to the whole CGI world, any kind of hand-drawn animation I have a real appreciation for. But the fact that you have John Huston doing the voice of Gandalf, like it's, I mean, that's a perfect pairing. Like it's just magical. And then later with the Bakshi one, I think Aragorn, his voiceover was done by John Hurt.
Yes, it was.
Which is a fantastic pairing, and both of those being just amazing actors. And then, of course, with the Peter Jackson films, you have, you know, some very Shakespearean trained, you know, considered some of the best of British acting in those films, where you have Ian McKellen playing Gandalf, who does a masterful job. I mean, he's played many great parts, whether from big pictures to smaller ones, but there's a wonderful video essay just about how Ian McKellen uses his face to act, like the movement of his eyes to convey certain scenes in The Lord of the Rings, and it's just a masterwork. And then you have Christopher Lee, who, even though got his start in Hammer horror, certainly I think at that point was considered one of the greats of British acting, and definitely had a background in Shakespearean acting, as Ian McKellen did. So I think having people in the high end of the acting world that involved with the project gave it a very high degree of respect.
Yeah, definitely. And also the fact that they took some risks with the other casting, and that they weren't casting unknowns, but sort of lesser known actors in a film that was, a real kind of tentpole release. Shout out to Sean Bourne, Sean Bean, Sean Bean.
Oh, yeah.
Just
Well,
because
yeah.
he gives an absolutely fantastic performance. But also, I'd like to. People criticize Orlando Bloom, but I think he does a really good job of conveying an elf the sort of sense of distance that they feel to the mortal characters. And there's the scene where they are in where they're in the mines of Moria and the Balrog's about to appear, and they ask Gandalf what the fuck it is, and he says it's a Balrog, and it there is a shot where it's like on Legolas's face, and you can see this sense of terror as he kind of the realization comes to him, and it's something fans of Tolkien's world will pick up on, because obviously there's a long history with the Balrogs and the elves, but it's also just a subtle way of conveying that without being really explicit about it or too on the nose or whatever. And it comes from his performance there.
Those details in the movie are absolutely spectacular. I could point out so many of them. Another one that I'm a really big fan of is I don't think Peter Jackson has too much sympathy with Christianity, or let alone Catholicism in particular. But when Boromir dies, Aragorn does a movement where he touches his forehead and then kisses his fingers. And Peter Jackson said that was meant to be a reference to Tolkien's Catholicism, and that it was supposed to be a sort of primitive sign of the cross in a kind of pre-Christian fantasy world, and as a kind of religious gesture to Eru Ilúvatar, the one god there, in a moment where it was appropriate, seeing his friend pass away.
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of it's peppered with all of these references that fans steeped in the lore will get, but also you can just enjoy the films as they are, independently of all of this kind of extra material.
Absolutely. Yeah, and how the architecture of Rivendell is based on Gothic cathedrals and abbeys, and Jackson did that purely because he liked Tolkien so much that he wanted what he felt were Tolkien's aesthetic influences to be present in the movie, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah. Well, in the Shire being very much what Tolkien envisioned of the English countryside.
Yeah,
absolutely. And another note with that, I think anyone who's not super familiar with the film world, I think Viggo Mortensen does a fantastic job playing Aragorn, and there's so many different scenes to point out, but one of my favorite emotional ones is at the end of The Return of the King, where he refuses to have the hobbits bow to him, and he instead bows as the newly king of essentially the human world, bows to the hobbits. I think is a fantastic one.
Yes, the moment where all men cry.
Yeah.
I always cry at Boromir's death as well.
Yeah, that one. Well, and that's, and talk about Tolkien's Christianity. I mean, Boromir is one who is tempted and kind of almost fulfills that temptation. And yet at the end of his character, sacrifices himself to save Frodo and the hobbits. In a very sort of noble sacrifice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is a very Christian theme.
Right, and the choirs during that part in the movie soundtrack, they're singing in Kenya, the Elvish language, words that his brother Faramir actually says in the book, which is I do not, something along the lines of, I do not love the arrow for its swiftness, nor the sword for its sharpness. I love only that which they defend. I thought that was a really powerful moment to include, where Boromir, in a sense, redeems himself by fighting desperately to defend Merry and Pippin in his last moments.
And the film connection, though, I wanted to mention is that if anyone's not terribly familiar with Viggo Mortensen's filmography, essentially playing the greatest good guy potentially ever in Aragorn. There's a movie called The Prophecy where Viggo plays, in my opinion, one of the greatest film scenes of all time. And it's not a terribly long role, but if one is ever interested, I highly recommend checking out The Prophecy. It's the one with Christopher Walken actually playing the angel Gabriel, and he has a confrontation with Viggo, who plays Lucifer, and it's a fantastic, he just chews out the scene. Fantastic.
Oh, cool. I'll have to check that out. Cool. Any other thoughts before we move on to a lengthy discussion of Tom Bombadil?
Hell yeah.
Now we're going deep.
Oh yeah, that's a fierce debate amongst fans. Why did they include Tom Bombadil in the films? Tom Bombadil isn't important. But yeah.
That's the way to distinguish a good geek from a regular guy.
It's probably one of the most contested figures in Tolkien's Legendarium, and it's yeah, for somebody who's really just so whimsical. But no, I mean, I don't really have anything to add other than talking about Tolkien's influence on metal. I think that it's interesting to note that overall, uh, we have a genre of music that is deeply invested in creating a sort of landscape like mythology for modern people to lose themselves in, so to speak, which Tolkien was arguably aiming to do the same thing. And in modern discourse, romanticization of something is often used as a sort of criticism. You know, you're making something seem better than it was. And I think that metal, while it's never necessarily directly addressed that criticism, though it could arguably be guilty of that, um, Tolkien directly addressed it, although under a different name of escapism, in which he said something along the lines of, if my friend is trapped in enemy territory, then it is my duty to help him escape. So I do not see escapism as an insult. I see it as a badge of honor. And I think that somewhat speaks to what both metal and Tolkien have accomplished for modern readers and listeners.
Yeah.
I think one other thing, God, there's so many things to mention. Maybe this will be my last one, but even though a lot of people have tried to say, oh, the Lord of the Rings in some way was about World War II, it's not really, and it's not even really about World War One, but I think the idea, because the idea of war and the idea of comradeship, I think, is very much part of Lord of the Rings. It's important to note that this isn't something that Tolkien was just purely an academic, that he did fight as a soldier in World War One, and I do think those experiences informed his sense of loyalty, comradeship, brotherhood, that he experienced in what was some pretty awful and horrible battles.
Well, yeah, definitely. And you could also make the comparison with something like orcs as well, in terms of their allegory for soldiers. I know Tolkien wasn't a fan of allegory, but yeah, just the sense of what war or hardship does to creatures, and you get out what you put in, I suppose. And yeah, it's important to mention that he experienced a lot of this stuff firsthand. Anyway, yeah, Belisario, any other thoughts?
Well, my conclusion, maybe to wrap this up, would be that Tolkien and metal have a lot in common, because both visions of the world look back to an ancient past or a mythology that can inform our actual lives and our real lives, and can be even more important than that. And I think it is quite telling, the fact that most of the metal bands are not inspired by the movies, or sometimes not even by the most well-known books like The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, but they instead insist of diving into obscure passages from the Silmarillion and really remote stuff, both geographically as historically, like to really explore the further limits of Middle-earth, in order to get really lost in that world. And I think this is quite illustrative of the point we're making here.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Cool. Well, yeah, if you haven't heard of Tolkien, we recommend reading some of his books, because they are a very good companion piece to listening to various genres of metal, as I hope we've made clear in this rather lengthy discussion. And yeah, I'd like to thank all of you guys very much for that discussion. As I said at the top of the episode, I am quite hanging over today quite badly, so I'm not necessarily firing on all cylinders. So yeah, thank you very much for contributing so much there, and thank you, listeners, very much if you've made it this far. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion. We'll hopefully be doing more episodes like this in the future as well, maybe even a part 2 on Tolkien, because as Joseph said, there's still quite a lot more to say. But yeah, we'll wrap it up there because we're well over the 2-hour mark now. But yeah, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.